Okay, so in the interest of not falling behind, I'm going to do a real brief Chapter 9 lecture so we can focus on the discussion while in class. Okay, so when it comes to male to female IPV, sociodemographic characteristics of batterers. So, there's certain patterns that we can usually get from learning these demographic characteristics, but they don't necessarily account for incidents of abuse because 85% of victims are women between the ages of 18 to 54, but that doesn't necessarily tell us too much about preventative natures. And IPV takes place across all sectors of society, but the surveys and data that we do have suggest that it's most prevalent within working class or blue collar families. When it comes to definitions of IPV and abuse, of course, definitions are always important, and we've talked about this a lot. Definitions are essential to having a shared understanding of importance and having a way to litigate these things as criminal violations. So, definitions are changing, especially as more research is exploring different dimensions of intimate partner violence. So, the terminology has changed from marital abuse or spousal abuse to intimate partner violence somewhat recently, which is supposed to encompass all of the factors related to violence, including sexual assault and stalking. So, IPV has become kind of an umbrella term to explain all of those features. So, factor analysis just found certain factors related to IPV, and they talk about this a little bit at length in your book. But some of the factors that are specifically related in research are control, humiliation, blame, physical violence, injuries, abuse of pets, and child abuse. So, you can kind of see how the same kind of psychological mechanisms of controlling a spouse can or intimate partner can often transfer into violence against others within the household. When it comes to patterns of IPV, there's what's called the cycle of violence, right? We talked about this a little bit with last chapter. The idea that there's a period where tension builds within a couple, right? It's kind of like the walking on eggshells phase, where, the person that is being abused feels the other person, becoming more on edge. They're trying to accommodate them so that they don't, have any sort of incident. And then typically what happens is this explodes into some sort of violent altercation. And then the abuser typically will repent right after the battering incident. What's called the honeymoon phase, where they will often, do romantic gestures like roses or things like that. Will often, really have these talks with their victims of, I would never do this, I just love you so much, and blah, blah, blah. Really just kind of manipulate a person emotionally into staying in a situation like this. And then what happens is the honeymoon phase eventually wears off and slips right back into that tension building again, that walking on eggshells. And it becomes this cycle, right? This circle of violence. All right, when it comes to estimates of intimate partner violence, of course, remember these are based on what information we do have. When it comes to homicides, suicides, and feminicides, homicide is the least likely outcome of a domestic assault, but often cases of IPV that lead to death are not categorized that way like in the official reports. So the stats are a little bit flawed there, so we're not quite sure about the prevalence because of the way that they're labeled. So suicides in cases of IPV, are elevated from the threat of the overall population. So there's more cases going on there than the overall population, especially when alcohol is part of that equation. And just to, I have to kind of work this in there, and I'm going to put up an article about this in the additional resources online. But, if you guys were aware, and we'll talk about it in class during the discussion aspect of the incident that just took place in San Bernardino, where a man went into a school and shot his wife, that they were separated. Um, and two of her students, she worked with disabled students, and um, basically one of the kids was killed, she was killed, and then he killed himself. And I'll just bring it up in class when we talk about this stuff, just how, you know, when San Bernardino happened, what, a year ago, when there was like a terrorist kind of event, that was reported in a very different way than what's going on right now with this San Bernardino incident, because this is very common. And unfortunately, it's all too familiar to what we're talking about in this class, right? The fact that when women try to break away, that is when they are most likely to be killed, right? So we'll talk about that more in class, but I mean, I had to bring that up for now. All right. When it comes to sexual assault, definitions in the past of rape were too narrow to encompass the kinds of incidents that victims face, especially because rape is termed as force and verbal refusal, like saying no. Um, so that alone is often not understood as rape. So definitions tend to be different and they have changed a lot over time, but some definitions count only vaginal penetration as rape, while many experience forced sexual behaviors such as forced oral sex or objects or other things in a penetrative way. So surveys show that when it comes to women in IPV relationships, they often face sexual assault and rape in the relationships with frequency. So in one study of battered wives, 87% of women reported that their husbands thought it was okay to have sex with them whenever they wanted. Didn't matter what they wanted. So nearly half had been coerced into having sex after coming home from the hospital giving birth, which you can definitely see in I Am Not Your Victim, right? Something that we've been talking about through that book. So the fact that her experience, which is just, kind of horrific to most, this idea of like, you just had a baby, you should have some time to rest. The expectation of sex is still, when someone believes in such a patriarchal way that they own another person and their body, they don't care if you just had a baby or not. And that's horrifying. So, anyway, these definitions of sexual assault are important because oftentimes people dismiss or don't take seriously cases that don't fit a legal definition, right? Or the past legal definitions. So, there is a problem in the fact that even like the verbal consent itself, the idea that, they used to say that you had to prove that you had some sort of, struggle, that you'd put up some sort of struggle, right? These kind of things are ridiculous because the more research that's done, the more that we understand, some people freeze like a deer in headlights, right? So the idea that you would say that what happened to them didn't happen or wasn't a valid thing because they had a natural biological reaction, which is to freeze up in an incident of trauma. A lot of people do that, right? In incidents of war or being mugged or whatever, like in incidents of trauma. That's a pretty common reaction. So, anyway, as more research comes out, the more we understand these things, the better we get at defining them. So, that's why sexual assault is kind of, again, an umbrella term to encompass all of these behaviors, right? But that this is really prevalent within IPV relationships because it comes down to this idea again of owning or controlling, having control over someone and even their sexuality. So when it comes to psychological and emotional abuse of intimate partners, research shows that psychological abuse is often the most common form of partner abuse. So this is an important thing to understand, that it's the most common form, because first of all, we tend to not take psychological abuse as something that's as seen as important, which is really wrong because again, the mind does manifest in the body. And also, it can be debilitating having this psychological abuse. That can often be more damaging in the long run than the physical abuse because it's something that stays with you for a long time. And so, the idea that some women, it's discounted that they are abused, or it's misunderstood that they are being abused because they have no physical signs of bruises. That doesn't mean that the pain is not happening on the inside, right? So, this is often experienced as abusers will isolate their partner, or commit like economic abuse, which you'll see through the case of I Am Not Your Victim, Sam kind of controls the financial opportunities that Beth has. And so that makes it so that, she's completely economically dependent upon him. So he's able to control her by keeping her dependent upon money. And there's all these incidents where he doesn't pay for things and the kids are going without. And she has to really go through a lot just to be able to support herself. This is also a situation where typically with psychological or emotional abuse, there's degradation, right? Where the person will degrade their partner in front of others or, in front of the children. Often there's those, again, rigid sexual expectations that, if you're my wife, that, sex is just a marital duty. And there's this monopolization of the victim's life that you're the only one that matters in their life. No one else should matter. That all of their time and energy should be focused right on that one person, right? And it's very common for abusers to use psychological destabilization techniques, which means doing things to make a person think that they're going crazy. So you will see this also in I Am Not Your Victim as we're reading through the end of it. I don't want to give it away necessarily. We'll talk about it in the discussion. But there's often common situations where abusers will, you know, um, make someone's car not work, move their car keys, damage things, move things, just basically make this person think that they're losing their mind, right? And so the most common controlling behavior, though there's different elements to this controlling behavior, such as coercive control, so meaning getting your way in every situation, and feeling powerless, so taking out your powerless feelings on your victim, is really the kind of most common way that this plays out. When it comes to non-lethal assault estimates, women are victims in about 85% of cases, and separated women tend to be victimized at a rate 3 times higher than the rate for divorced women and 25 times higher than the rate for married women. So again, this idea that, why don't women leave? Well, because oftentimes that's, when victimization can happen. Society's attitude towards batterers. So you would think that because this is a violent crime and we tend to value life and have a deviant perception of violence in the culture, you would think that we would condemn batterers, but often the violence that men use against women, and again, obviously women also can use this against men, but just it's disproportionately men using it against women at this point, from the data that we do have. It's often explained away or excused by the larger society. And of course, this is getting better. Like the difference between the narratives and I Am Not Your Victim to today, and that's important. Like that's a good thing that we see, but we can still see that there's a very commonality of arguments when it comes to like, well, why do people stay? Well, how are they are also at fault in these situations? And those kind of ideas are still prevalent. When it comes to batterers' attributions for male to female IPV, batterers tend to blame their own aggression on anyone or anything but themselves, right? They can never see themselves as the problem, right? It's got to be someone else. It's because someone made them angry, right? Not because they can't control their anger. In the book, they talk about Johnson's violent couple categories, which is, just this guy who's trying to understand abuse in the dimensions of severity and control. So he created several models of partner violence to understand this. So the first is situational couple violence, which is the most frequently occurring type of intimate partner violence. It is a low-level, non-severe kind of, situational violence that's perpetrated by both members of a couple. Usually, in this situation, one individual is being violent, but neither one is being controlling, meaning that it happens in a non-severe, kind of common way, but not, no one's trying to control the other. In the second kind of couple category that he created was mutually violent control, where both the individual and the partner are violent and controlling. So that's a very damaging model for a relationship, obviously. The third kind of relationship model or couple category he created was violent resistance, which is what he determined to be a self-defensive type of IPV, meaning that the person is violent but not controlling. So basically, someone's using violence, but in a way to protect themselves from someone that is using violence and being controlling towards them. But they're just using the violence to react, right? And so that's committed overwhelmingly by women. And then the fourth level is what he calls intimate terrorism, which is, where only one partner is violent and controlling, and it's perpetuated overwhelmingly by men. When it comes to individual differences between batterers, researchers have looked at all sorts of differences, trying to figure out what like specific personality traits can account for male aggressive behaviors. So some that have been identified are just being abusive, having like abusive situations in their own past, having very patriarchal views, patriarchal beliefs, being very rigid and unyielding, controlling, aloof, ashamed, impulsive, self-centered, jealous, moody, depressed, someone that's very stereotypically masculine or hypermasculine, all of those kind of things. That's typically, the book goes into this in some depth. Um, that's kind of important to understanding, um, what personality traits you can look out for to kind of determine the likelihood of someone battering. Okay, so some more attitudes and classifications of batterers. First up here is denial and minimization. So we've kind of mentioned this before. Abusers tend to downplay or minimize the significance and seriousness of their violence. So often they will claim that they didn't really hurt their female partner, like, she's fine, it's not a big deal, it's over, it was a misunderstanding. So they deny that it's a problem and they minimize the problem that they made. Another common issue is anger, hostility, and intermittent explosive disorder. So anger has become one of the most studied traits related to family violence, but it also serves as a motive for male assaults. So hostility also appears to be the same as anger, but it is about a person's dislike and negative evaluation of others. So meaning that anger and hostility tend to be correlated, and they tend to feed on each other. So while intermittent explosive disorder is recognized as a psychiatric condition, where an individual has periodic dangerous assaults that are extreme responses to stressors. One survey found that two-thirds of individuals with a history of intimate partner violence suffered IED, explosive, one of these intermittent explosive disorder episodes during an anger attack. So that's, a big part of that as well that needs to be understood. Also, some more like emotional issues would be depression, self-esteem, shame, guilt, and humiliation. So, depression is another often thing that's experienced by batterers as well as their victims, right? And low self-esteem is another important factor in batterers' mentality because a lot of them have such low self-esteem. That's why they have such a overwhelming need for control. Also, childhood feelings of shame, humiliation, and guilt may play a role into male, in a role in male to female IPV. And typically, that shame is developed through parental punishments and childhood abuse that they've experienced that was central to their, adult abusiveness, meaning that it kind of affected their identity formation as a young person. And so they develop these feelings of shame. So to overcome that, they've learned that violence overcomes that. There's also an issue of lack of awareness or automaticity, meaning that some researchers argues that abusers are often unaware of the feelings underlying their behaviors. So they're not necessarily like thinking in depth why they're doing what they're doing. So if they have feelings like anger, worthlessness, depression, fear, they're not really understanding why or thinking about how that's causing their violence. So they may develop cognitive biases that lead them to misinterpret events. So they, again, kind of going back to the idea of learning to see everyone else as at fault and themselves as never at fault. Plus, they may have certain cues that set them off to anger and violence, right? So meaning that acting with aggression becomes kind of a habit, that automaticity for them. It just kind of wires into their brain that that's how you react. When it comes to empathy, some theorize that batterers have very low empathy, but little research has really focused on this so far. When it comes to attachment difficulties and emotional dependence, more and more research has found a link between attachment difficulties and intimate partner violence for both men and women. So, emotional dependency is common in abusers because they're more sensitive to the fears of abandonment, so they react very negatively to any slight emotional disturbance. And of course, jealousy. That's a huge one, right? A lot of researchers looked at jealousy as a source of conflict. That's a major factor in incidents of intimate partner violence. Lots of research, has looked at this, and a lack of interpersonal trust appears to have a bearing on attachment disorders and dependency needs in, partner violent men. So, intimate partners' extreme jealousy poses a risk for possible fatal violence, even if there's been no previous violence, right? Jealousy tends to be that thing that can, really explode and push people to these kind of events. So, it's one of those things, again, we talked about this in class. It's been so normalized in the culture that it's a good thing that someone should be jealous, right? That if someone isn't jealous, that there's something wrong. But really, jealousy is just insecurity, like this little picture I put here. Okay, marital dissatisfaction or satisfaction. So, obviously, as assumed, research has found that those in abusive relationships have lower marital satisfaction, than men who are not violent. And marital discords can be a predictor of male battering recidivism. Okay, so when it comes to becoming and remaining a batterer, obviously socialization is one of the first things we're going to look at from a sociological perspective, as how violence is a learned behavior. And socialization plays a pivotal role in transgenerational explanations of partner violence. Obviously, this has a lot to do with childhood socialization. So, if they experienced child abuse as a kid or witnessed interparental violence and that was normalized, or experienced childhood attachment trauma, or trauma as a result of their experiences, then they might not be critically understanding how those experiences have impacted their use of abuse in their adulthood. So child abuse and trauma are very highly linked, and those kind of long-term issues last, right? Those are the socialization process of a child is very impactful for the rest of their lives. So the issues that you face within that time period are going to really set up the foundation for, your adult life. So if you don't get the kind of help that people need to get through these things, a lot of people, it's been normalized and they end up reproducing that violence within their own relationships. When it comes to verbal skills and communication difficulties also lead to conflicts, right? That's related to anyone in any relationship ever. If you don't have good communication, you're going to have conflicts. So, some research has shown that batterers often misperceive the quality or number of caring gestures they receive from their wives. So, often batterers don't know how to use conflict resolution strategies, so they don't really know how to talk, they don't know how to de escalate, right? And so the result of that is high marital distress. And again, that's often due to people witnessing IPV in their childhood and them thinking that when I get mad, I react with violence. I don't talk about it. I don't talk about my feelings. And, oh, when you do that, it makes me feel this, right? That's something that, that people are kind of reproducing from their own experiences. When it comes to alcohol, drug abuse, and battering, there's a strong relationship between alcohol and drug abuse and battering, but it's a complicated relationship. So surveys found that batterers often use drugs or alcohol, but more used both. And some studies argue that it's antisocial personality traits or avoidance coping that's to blame for the relationship between alcohol, drugs, and IPV. So it's not necessarily that someone gets drunk and that's why they commit violence against someone. It's because they're drinking because they already are trying to cope with some other problems, and the violence is still the result of their instability, basically. So it gets complicated when you start to look at different factors, like the prevalence of child abuse in their childhood often leads to impulsivity, which is a risk factor for alcohol consumption. So they are related. The relationship's just kind of complex in the directionality aspect. When it comes to stress, emotions, mood states, and PTSD, in relation to stress, young age, unemployment, and violence towards non family members were all strong predictors of male to female IPV. And many of the men are survivors of child abuse. They may be facing issues of PTSD from observing father to mother violence, right? from experienced violence directed at them when they were a kid, or just the shaming and insecure attachment issues that they have as a result of their experiences as kids. And some think that evolutionary biology makes men aggressive, right? So newer research in this field acknowledges the factors of nurture, right? And argues that hormones or neurotransmitters may drive male violence, but there's obviously a more complicated situation there, that obviously gender is mitigating these issues. So, we talked about this a little bit before, the kind of essentialism that evolutionary biology has, that we're kind of like, it's really sexist in the assumption that men are just somehow born violent or with a predisposition to be much more violent because of testosterone. But there's we talked about this too. The testosterone has a permissive effect, which means that it's actually quite the other way around. It's when you're being more aggressive that heightens your levels of testosterone more so than your level of testosterone makes you aggressive. So, anyway, it's just kind of an oversimplification when you're not taking into account the social context in which it's happening. Personality disorders are important to understanding batterers. So often batterers are diagnosed with personality disorders such as passive dependent or compulsive disorders, narcissistic or antisocial disorders, or schizoidal or borderline personality disorders. So basically, lots of batterers are mentally ill or have, thought or behavior patterns that are abnormal or maladaptive, but a lot of them haven't been able to seek help. And I do think, that does also relate to the culture and the fact that we tend to, kind of shame or humiliate or just not really accept people when it comes to mental illness. And since men are taught in the culture that they're not allowed to ask for help, that's kind of even compounded even more. So a lot of men don't seek out mental health, help that could really prevent a lot of some of these issues. Okay. When it comes to female to male intimate partner abuse, there is first, when they started doing the research on this, the first female to male abuse that they noted was self-defensive violence. So a lot of the data are first person interpretation, so it's hard to say how empirical it is. But research found that women use violence, so like 66% of their violence was self-defense. So sometimes women are using violence, but sometimes they're using it as a self-defense mechanism. When it comes to motives for female to male intimate partner violence, over time it's become clear that not all women using violence are doing so in self-defense. In one study in your book, they talk about, found that motivations included the partner provoking violence. So again, blaming the victim, like he did something wrong, he deserves that, so I used violence as a self-defense. Stress, retaliation for emotional abuse, meaning he wasn't caring about me or my feelings, so I used violence. To show feelings that are hard to explain in words. So again, the importance of the ability to communicate there so that you can express yourself in words and not, violence. And often women also said they did it to feel more powerful. So anger can also be an issue for female perpetrators, just like male perpetrators. And of course, partner control is a huge factor when it comes to female to male abuse, just like it is for male to female abuse. When it comes to correlates of female to male IPV, childhood abuse is linked to later experiences of female to male IPV, also linked to jealousy, powerlessness, and those anxious attachment styles where people feel it necessary to, control. And then there's women who kill, right? So women who kill that are in prison for murder, this is one of those stats that's really upsetting, that a lot of those women that are in prison for murder killed their intimate partners that are serving life in prison right now. They killed their abuser, and that's why they're in prison for life, right? Which is just wow. So battered woman syndrome was a term developed to understand these cases when people, caught to the criminal justice system in these cases, arguing that women were suffering from a trauma-induced condition that was later considered to be a subcategory of PTSD. So often women feel there's no other way to escape their situation or violent conflict, which leads them to a breaking point where they think that they might die, right? So I'm going to put a video clip in here that I discussed with you before about this woman that Her abuser came into her home and tried to attack and kill her. And she ended up, trying to defend herself, and he ended up dead as a result. And that she got charged with that crime. So I'm going to show you that video clip in here. And hopefully, this chapter review was short, sweet, but still informative.